Do you remember the flag that flew over Canada before the maple leaf? For most Canadians today, the red and white design seems eternal, like it was always there. But in 1964, the country stood at a crossroads. The Union Jack still sat in the corner of our national banner. Parliament erupted into one of the most passionate debates in Canadian history. Communities split, veterans marched, designers submitted thousands of proposals, and through 6 months of fierce argument, Canadians wrestled with a single question: who are we, really? How a piece of cloth became the battle line for Canadian identity, and how, in February 1965, a new flag rose over Parliament Hill for the very first time. This is the story of 1964. Canadians chose their new flag. Before the maple leaf, there was another banner that Canadians knew by heart. The Canadian Red Ensign hung in the corner of every post office. It snapped in the wind above Legion halls where veterans gathered on Friday nights. Teachers tacked it to classroom walls beside portraits of the Queen. Border guards saluted it at crossings from Windsor to White Rock. The design itself told a complicated story. In the upper left corner sat the British Union Jack, bold and unmistakable. The rest of the flag spread out in a deep red field, and at its centre lived the Canadian coat of arms, crowded with symbols borrowed from distant kingdoms: lions and unicorns, maple leaves and fleur-de-lis, imagery that reached back across the Atlantic to Westminster and Windsor Castle. Here was the strange truth about the ensign. It was never officially Canada's flag. No act of Parliament made it so. No ceremony declared it. The flag simply became Canadian through years of use and the weight of wartime memory. Soldiers carried it through 2 world wars. It draped coffins. It flew over hospital ships and victory parades. For veterans, for families with British roots stretching back generations, the ensign meant sacrifice and belonging. It connected them to the Commonwealth, to shared history written in blood and alliance. But for others, especially French Canadians and newer immigrants building lives in Toronto and Vancouver, that same flag carried a different meaning: colonial, borrowed, a symbol that looked backward instead of forward. You could feel the texture of old ensigns that had flown too long, the fabric worn thin, the colours faded from bright red to dusty rose, the sound of it in a strong wind, canvas cracking like a whip against the autumn sky. By the early 1960s, something was shifting. Canada was changing faster than its symbols could keep pace. The question was no longer if the flag would change, but when, and how, and at what cost. 3 years. That was all the time remaining before Canada turned 100 years old. In 1964, the calendar became a kind of pressure. The country was planning celebrations, building monuments, and preparing to show the world what a century of confederation had created. But the Prime Minister looked at that approaching milestone and saw something incomplete. Lester Pearson had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his diplomacy during the Suez Crisis. He understood symbols. He understood that nations needed more than good intentions. They needed markers of identity that belonged to them alone. Pearson believed Canada had outgrown borrowed emblems. He wanted a flag that spoke only of this country, this land, these people, free from colonial imagery, distinctly Canadian, something that could hang at the United Nations without explaining which empire it once belonged to. The political reality made it urgent. Quebec was restless. The Quiet Revolution was remaking French Canada, and the old ensign with its Union Jack felt like an insult to a province demanding recognition. Pearson needed Quebec. He needed a symbol that could bridge the two solitudes. On May 17, 1964, he stood before the Royal Canadian Legion Convention and made his announcement. The irony was almost cruel. Here, among veterans who loved the ensign like family, Pearson proposed replacing it. His design featured 3 red maple leaves joined on a white square, bordered by blue bars meant to represent the Atlantic and Pacific. Canada from coast to coast, rendered in geometry and colour. The room erupted. Veterans booed, some walked out. The Progressive Conservatives, led by John Diefenbaker, saw political opportunity in the outrage. Diefenbaker rose in the House of Commons and denounced the plan as abandonment, a betrayal of British heritage, an insult to every soldier who fought under the ensign. By early summer, Parliament had become a battleground. Members shouted across the aisle. Tempers flared during question period. The air in the chamber felt electric with anger and conviction. Battle lines formed not just between parties but between visions of what Canada was and what it could become. What Pearson thought might take weeks was becoming something far larger, a debate that would test the country itself. The House of Commons became a theatre of passion that summer. Every session packed the chamber beyond capacity. Public galleries filled hours before the debate began. Members rose to speak and kept speaking, voices growing hoarse as midnight approached and passed. The air itself felt charged, electric with conviction and anger. At the centre of the opposition stood John Diefenbaker, the former Prime Minister who had never lost his prairie lawyer's instinct for drama. Tall, silver-haired, a master of parliamentary performance who could fill a room with his voice alone. Diefenbaker spoke of battlefields, of Vimy Ridge and the Somme, of Holland and the liberation of Europe. The Ensign had flown over Canadian graves, he said. It represented every soldier who never came home. Changing it now meant severing the connection to Westminster, abandoning the traditions that made Canada what it was. His voice would rise until it rang off the chamber walls. Members heckled from the government benches. The Speaker called for order and called again, the gavel cracking like gunfire. But the debate refused to stay contained within Parliament. It spilled into every corner of Canadian life. Newspapers launched design contests. Families argued over Sunday dinner, fathers defending the old flag, while sons and daughters pushed for something new. Letters arrived at MPs' offices by the thousands, some eloquent, some furious, all deeply felt. The divide ran along fault lines of generation and region. Older Canadians, the ones who remembered the wars, clung to the ensign. Younger Canadians, born into peacetime prosperity, wanted a flag that looked forward. British Columbia resisted change. Parts of Ontario held firm to the British connection. Quebec supported the new flag almost unanimously, seeing liberation in the proposal. The prairies split down the middle, town by town, family by family. This was not policy, this was identity. This was belonging, and memory made visible. What Pearson thought would take a few weeks had stretched into months, and still no end appeared. While Parliament fought, ordinary Canadians were drawing their own answers. More than 3,500 submissions arrived at Parliament. They came from professional designers in Toronto studios, and from farmers sketching on kitchen tables in Saskatchewan. From schoolchildren and from veterans. From new immigrants and families whose roots reached back to Confederation. The designs covered every possibility the imagination could produce. Flags featuring beavers, proud and toothy. Flags with maple leaves by the dozen, scattered like autumn across fabric. Flags attempting compromise, wedging the French fleur-de-lis to British crowns and maple branches. Red flags, blue flags, green flags. Flags with stripes and stars and symbols borrowed from 100 different traditions. The parliamentary committee room became a gallery of national dreams. Long tables disappeared beneath paper and fabric. 15 members of Parliament, representing all parties, sat together with the impossible task of choosing. They sorted through amateur sketches, accompanied by letters explaining every element, every colour choice, every symbolic gesture. Professional presentations arrived in formal portfolios. Passionate explanations of what Canada meant, what it could mean, what it should become. Patterns emerged from the chaos. The maple leaf appeared again and again, hundreds of times, in every style and configuration. Red and white dominated the palette, Canada's official colours since 1921, though few Canadians knew that history. The committee debated, they discussed, they eliminated designs in rounds, narrowing thousands down to dozens, dozens down to a handful. Then came a submission from George Stanley, a historian at the Royal Military College. His design offered something different, a single maple leaf, 11 points, centered on white, 2 red bars flanking it like sentries. Nothing else. No crowns, no animals, no compromise symbols trying to please everyone, just the maple leaf, clean and modern, recognizable from great distances, simple enough that a child could draw it from memory. The elegance was in what it left out. In October 1964, the committee made its recommendation. Stanley's design, with small modifications, should become Canada's flag. The irony sat heavily in the committee room. While Parliament continued its endless debate, shouting and filibustering and refusing compromise, the committee had found its answer. Now came the harder part, getting Parliament to accept it. Autumn turned to winter, and still Parliament fought. Diefenbaker refused to yield. He deployed every weapon in the parliamentary arsenal, every procedural trick accumulated through decades in the House. The filibuster became his masterpiece. Endless speeches that stretched from afternoon into evening, into the small hours of the morning. Procedural challenges that stopped debate mid-sentence. Motions to adjourn, motions to reconsider, motions to delay. The machinery of democracy turned slower and slower until it nearly ground to a halt. Night sessions became routine. MPs slumped in their seats, exhausted. Coffee cups accumulated on desks like small fortifications. Ties hung loose, collar buttons undone. Voices grew hoarse from hours of speaking, shouting, and calling for order. Diefenbaker could speak for hours without notes, without pause, invoking every battle Canada ever fought, every connection to Westminster, every sacrifice made under the Ensign. He would pause for dramatic effect, letting silence fill the chamber before his voice rose again. Historical references tumbled out like ammunition. Emotional appeals to veterans, to tradition, to the dead who could not speak for themselves. The theatre was magnificent and maddening. Outside Parliament, frustration mounted. Polls showed most Canadians wanted a resolution, wanted the debate finished, and wanted their government to move on to other pressing matters. Pearson felt the pressure from every direction. His legislative agenda sat frozen. International observers watched with bemused confusion. The centennial clock kept ticking, and Canada still argued over its own symbol. In early December, Pearson made the decision: invoke closure. The parliamentary procedure allowed the government to end debate and force a vote, but it was rarely used, considered almost undemocratic. A violation of the traditions Diefenbaker claimed to defend. The opposition erupted. Accusations of dictatorship, questions about the democratic process, shouting filled the chamber. The speaker called for order over and over, voice straining to be heard above the chaos. The Liberals had the votes. They knew it. But using closure came with costs, political wounds that would take years to heal. December 1964, 6 months since Pearson first proposed the change. Finally, the debate would end. Canadians gathered around television sets like they were watching a championship game. In Legion halls across the country, veterans met to debate among themselves. Some defended the ensign with the fierce loyalty of men who had carried it into battle. Others sat quietly, nodding when someone suggested maybe, just maybe, it was time for something new. The arguments could turn heated. Friends for decades, suddenly on opposite sides of a divide neither expected. Neighbors who had borrowed tools and shared coffee for years found themselves avoiding certain topics. Churches split along generational lines, younger members impatient for change while older congregants held tight to familiar symbols. In Quebec, the support for the new flag was almost unanimous. French Canadians saw it as recognition, finally, that Canada belonged to them too. That independence meant more than proximity to Britain. Factory floors and office break rooms filled with flag talk. The debate pushed aside weather and hockey, becoming the only conversation that mattered. Coffee breaks turned into impromptu town halls, workers arguing positions with the passion usually reserved for playoff predictions. Schoolchildren watched their teachers try to explain both sides. Some picked favorites, drew maple leaf flags in their notebooks, or defended the ensign because their grandfathers had. Letters flooded newspaper editors, passionate arguments written in careful cursive, personal stories about what the flag meant, competing visions of Canadian identity fighting for space on the opinion pages. At family dinner tables, the divisions ran deepest. Fathers who served in the Second World War defended the ensign, voices tight with emotion they could not quite name. Sons and daughters pushed back, eager for a Canada that defined itself rather than inherited definition. For the older generation, the ensign meant fallen comrades, a sacrifice that could not be abandoned. For the younger, the new flag meant independence, the future sovereignty claimed rather than granted. As December approached, the country held its breath. 6 months of argument were ending. One way or another, Parliament would vote. December 15, 1964, arrived like the end of a long siege. The House of Commons chamber was filled beyond capacity. Public galleries are packed. The nation watched on television. After 6 months of battle, exhaustion hung alongside anticipation. The speaker called the vote. Members rose. Voices rang out. Yea, nay. The rhythm of democracy in spoken words. 163 in favour, 78 against. The maple leaf would become Canada's flag. Cheers erupted from government benches. Some Conservatives walked out. Others sat in silence. Lester Pearson stood vindicated, though the cost showed in his face. Diefenbaker rose one last time, defiant, warning that this was a mistake. Beyond Parliament, Quebec celebrated. Most of English Canada quietly accepted. Some Legion halls felt betrayal. Morning newspapers proclaimed it. Canada gets new flag. Maple leaf wins. Debate finally over. February 15, 1965. 2 months away. Flags needed manufacturing. Ceremonies required planning. The old ensign would be retired with dignity. After 6 months of argument, Canadians wondered what the raising would feel like. 2 months to wait. February 15, 1965 dawned bitterly cold in Ottawa. Snow covered Parliament Hill. Wind cut through coats. But thousands gathered. Dignitaries, veterans in uniform, ordinary Canadians bundled against winter. At noon exactly, the Canadian Red Ensign descended for the final time. Some placed their hands over their hearts, others wiped tears. The weight of history in that moment. A pause. Canada without a symbol. The pole stood against a grey sky. Then the new flag began its climb. Red and white rising, unfurling in February wind. The maple leaf caught and spread, clean lines against grey clouds. The cold bit faces. New fabric cracked and snapped. Applause. Some cheers. Some silence. The complexity of the moment. Across Canada, simultaneous ceremonies unfolded. Provincial legislatures, military bases, schools, and post offices. From St. John's to Victoria, the maple leaf rose. Pearson spoke about unity and the future, about a Canada that could disagree fiercely and emerge stronger. The flag flew through the afternoon, photographed endlessly, already becoming familiar. That February day marked a transformation. The months that followed brought something unexpected: rapid acceptance. The maple leaf appeared everywhere, on backpacks, t-shirts and souvenirs. Canadians wore their flag in ways they never had with the ensign. Within months, most struggled to imagine any other design. The speed surprised even Pearson. The timing proved perfect. In 1967, Canada's centennial celebrations featured the maple leaf everywhere. At Expo 67 in Montreal, at the Olympics, the flag became Canada's calling card. Simple enough that children could draw it, distinctive enough to be recognized at great distances. What made it work was clarity. No compromise symbols, just the maple leaf, unmistakably Canadian. The debate revealed something important: that Canadian identity was evolving. The country could handle fierce disagreement and emerge intact. Veterans who opposed it eventually accepted it. The younger generation never knew the controversy. Do you remember seeing the new flag for the first time? Share your memories in the comments. Subscribe for more Canadian history. A piece of cloth became the symbol of a nation. Through argument and democracy, Canada chose who it wanted to be. That choice, made in winter 1965, still flies above us today.